Hello everyone and welcome to my blind pick tier list for season 14. In this video I'm going to talk about what are the best blind picks at the moment and also just in general what makes a champ a good blind pick. I'll make sure to timestamp everything in the comment section below, so feel free to check that out if you do want to skip around. I want to start by quickly talking about why blind picking is so important. So having a good blind pick is all about maximizing your impact on the game. It's about putting yourself in a position to consistently carry because you're going to be the common factor. And the reason I bring that up is because sometimes people say to me, oh, like this champion is a good blind. I always manage to, at least go even. But something that's kind of important is that you can win a bad matchup and still not be that impactful. So an example would be, let's say you're blinding something like Cassiopeia, right? Not a particularly good blind. You come up against a champ like Syndra. You're expected as Cassiopeia Syndra to go down maybe 20 or 25 CS. Now, if you play really well, if you have a lot of skill, you could potentially end up with like a 5 CS lead versus Syndra, right? And that would be, again, it takes a lot of skill. You would have played very well. But the problem is a 5 CS lead going to carry the game? Is a 5 CS lead that impactful? The answer is not really, right? So instead, if you're that much better than your opponent, that you can end up turning a losing matchup into a slightly favorable one, if you blind picked better, you would probably be able to have a much greater lead or a much greater impact on the game. So that's why blinding is so important. And the reason I bring that up as an example is because when I was new to League, when I was climbing the ranks for the first time, I was a Cassiopeia one trick up until around D2, and I went from D2 to D4, D5, back to D2, sometimes to D1 for about 4 months, right? And I was winning some of these matchups that were considered quite hard for Cassio, so I thought, why aren't I climbing? And then about, after 5 months of being in Diamond, I started playing Ahri, and I started using Ahri as my blind pick, and then I used Cassio as my counter. And I went from D2 to Master in about a week, because what happened was these games where I'd end up before in bad matchups, I would end up having a lot more impact as Ahri. And then when I countered with Cass, I would absolutely obliterate my opponent, because I was a lot better than D2 skill level at that point. So obviously, having a good blind can help you, but it's not going to fix everything, right? Like I said, I went from D2 to Master. It's not like I went from Gold to Challenger or something, right? It's one of those skills that, yeah, it helps you a little bit. It's not going to completely revolutionize the game for you. And one final thing I'll mention before I talk about the criteria is that there is no such thing as a perfect blind. Every champ is weak against something. Every champ does struggle in some sort of situation. But again, it's about kind of maximizing your impact over a long period of time or a large sample size of games. So then what are we considering when we're deciding if a champ is a good blind or not? So I have some criteria here, and I'll read them out to you, and then I'll explain them one by one. So I think about the champion's matchups, how they fit into compositions, a combination of, what safety and mobility do they have? Are they a flex pick? And finally, how OP are they? So let's go through those one by one. First off, the matchups. So some champions might just have a lot of winning matchups in the current meta, or they might just be a strong laner in general and are able to win a lot of lanes. There are also champions that are really good neutralizers. So a champ like Ahri, for example, even in some of the more difficult lanes, can generally go even or have a slight deficit, more so than some other champs, right? So even if a champ doesn't necessarily win all their lanes, the ability to go even in all your lanes can be quite valuable as a blind as well. Something else that's kind of important with matchups is thinking about, does your champion need to snowball? So if you take something really extreme, like let's imagine you play something like Kalista mid, right? Kalista mid, even though it can be a blind pick in the sense that it is just very strong, Kalista mid has to snowball, right? In fact, it has to snowball out of control. So in that sense, like while maybe Kalista mid would end up being a mid-tier blind pick, it's probably just a way, way better counter pick because it needs to snowball. It needs to get stuff done. So that's worth thinking about as well. For comps, what you want to think about is, do they fit into most team comps and are they good against most enemy comps? So some champs are really well-rounded. Again, a champ like Ori can play into just about anything, can play with just about anything, whereas some champs are very purpose-built. You think of something like Lissandra, it's kind of anti-assassin, anti-dive, maybe plays very well with engage, right? Or you say something like Galio that works extremely well with things on your team like Camille and Rakan, but honestly just isn't that strong outside of that. So those champs would kind of lose points for blind pick ability because they're not good into most comps and they're not good with most comps, but they can be very powerful with those things around them. Another thing to think about is their safety and mobility. So some champs gain safety just from huge amounts of range. A champion like Lux, they can just kind of clear away from, far away. Even in a difficult matchup, they'll generally be fine. And I think having mobility as a blind is nice. It's not necessarily required, but having some form of mobility, whether that's a dash or phase rush or, even it can even be some sort of self-peel like a stun or something, is pretty nice because what you're scared of is, let's say you blind pick in a mobile champion and then you come up against something like Jarvan LeBlanc. It's going to be very, very hard to play up against that combo if you don't have a dash, especially if they have a ganking support as well, like a Leona or a Nautilus. So blind picking and having mobility or some form of safety is generally nice. A nice little bonus is if your champion is a flex pick. So for example, a champion like Karma is potentially like a triple flex, right? She can be played mid, top support. You could probably even play her ADC if you want. And so a champ like Karma gains value as a blind pick because people won't necessarily know it's Karma mid. One thing I'd also really recommend is that if you are picking a flex pick as your blind, ban something from another lane. So for me, like if I plan on picking Jayce mid, especially if my top laner is picking last, I will often ban Irelia. Because Irelia top's pretty good on a Jayce, and so that'll make the enemy team think that this is Jayce top, or at the least, it'll confuse them a little. Perhaps they won't know it's Jayce mid, and that can help me get a slightly better matchup. And lastly, something that unfortunately we have to consider is just in general how OP is the champ. So sometimes champs are OP enough that even if they, by the rest of the criteria aren't necessarily a good blind, if they're OP enough in the meta, you might just want to lock them in because they're kind of free elos. So an example right now would be something like Aurelion Sol. I think Aurelion Sol was typically not a very good blind pick, but I honestly think ASOL at the moment is OP enough that you can blind him. He just is that strong. Even if you go down a little bit in lane, the champ scales so incredibly well that you're probably going to carry the game from then on out. So yeah, how OP a champ is a factor. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get to the champs themselves. So the first one on our list is Ahri, and Ahri, starting off strong, is probably the best blind pick in the game. She is an extremely good neutralizer, has mobility, is very, very strong right now. Can play into just about any sort of comp, can play with just about any sort of comp. The only real weaknesses Ahri has is she has a couple difficult matchups. So something like an Orianna can be very difficult in the 1v1 if you don't have any gank set up on your team. Sometimes champs that kind of scale for free can be sort of annoying as well. Like if you come up against a Kassadin, for example, and you're not able to snowball the game in time, then that can be tough. But as I said, no perfect blinds, right? And Ahri is probably the most perfect blind of any of them in the game. Akali is, I would say, probably a low A. I expect her to move down a bit as I move more champs on here. She's probably the best blindable AP assassin from what I can think of. She's got a lot of tools to neutralize lanes, right? She's got a lot of sustain, D-shield second wind, fleet if you need it. She can play with most comms. She does kind of struggle, like if your team doesn't have a lot of follow-up, or if their team has a ton of peel, that can be hard. And there are a couple decently difficult matchups, so stuff like Ryze and LeBlanc can be kind of hard. But overall, Akali is a fairly solid blind, maybe not the best, but, she is also a flex as well, at least sort of. Akali mid's a lot more common than top, but it has its place, so probably a low A for me. Akshan, it probably depends on what you value. So the thing with Akshan is that Akshan wins most of his lanes, but the things that really, bring Akshan down for me is that he kind of needs to snowball. And there also are a lot of matchups that are either capable of neutralizing him or just straight up capable of beating him. So I think Akshan might be an S tier counter pick in my mind, but overall, I think as you get higher elo and people are able to play the Akshan counters better, stuff like a Syndra or a Hwei, I think it can be kind of rough. That being said, I think in lower elos, it's probably closer to an A. Like, I'd say if you're below Diamond, maybe it's an A, but I honestly think as you get higher, it kind of falls off as a blind. And again, I think he's much better used as a counter pick. So, Anivia, I want to say, is probably a C tier blind. There's maybe an argument for B. Like, look, she's not the worst blind in the world. The thing is that normally once Anivia gets 6, she does have the ability to neutralize most lanes. That being said, she really suffers to being outranged. She suffers to ganks it up. She can be punished by lots of heavy engage, especially in the early game. Like something like, again, a LeBlanc Jarvan. Even if you beat LeBlanc 1v1, it can be quite hard. Now, some sort of engage, something like maybe like a Rel or something that you can kite out. Anivia actually does counter in the mid game, and Anivia is quite good against kind of shorter range, melee champs in general. I think for me, it's like, maybe a low B or a high C where you can counter or you can blind with this champ if you want, but I think she does just gain a lot more value as a counter pick to either shorter range mids or to short range comps in general. Playing a team of 4 or 5 melees against Anivia is absolutely just unplayable. So yeah, really high on the counter pick tier list, but I think kind of low on the blinds. Annie, I would say, is probably a high A or potentially an S. So the thing with Annie, again, plays well with most things, plays well against most things. Really, Annie's biggest weakness is there are some difficult lanes, but normally if you go something like Ahri Resolve, you'll even be able to deal with champs like Syndra and go, maybe slightly behind, but ultimately be okay. I think playing against heavy ganks up, so like, again, the combination of Syndra plus Jarvan or Syndra Rek'Sai, Syndra Zinzao, that can be pretty punishing for Annie. So she's not, the literal perfect blind, but she is pretty good. I would say Annie is overall a high A. So the first one on our list that is very I guess, meta-related is Sol. So I think in the past, Sol was not a particularly good blind, and the reason was that Sol was kind of balanced around a couple things. One, being able to get his stacks, so if you're able to deny that by stopping him from queuing the wave, something like a Syndra or a Yone, it was very hard. And also, you know, champs that could stop him from Wing forward, it made it hard to get a lot of his DPS off, and that's still the case. But I honestly think the champ is just overtuned enough that he should be considered a blind, again, just because he's that OP. That being said, like, if this champ gets nerfed, I would say he's not a good blind. I'd actually say he's probably like a C tier blind, maybe above Anivia, or potentially like a low B. At the moment, though, I think he definitely makes it into A tier, but this is specifically because he is overtuned at the moment. The upcoming nerf to Sol is pretty minor anyway, so I expect this to stay the case for a while as well. Azir is another one. So Azir has, for the most part, been an extremely good blind pick. I mean, Azir has basically everything in his kit. His stealth peel, strong laning phase, scales well, plays well into just about everything. Recently, though, there have been some nerfs to him that I think make him not the S tier blind that he was. I think previously he was here. Those are, first off, they nerf its health regen a bit, which means that in those lanes where you can get punished, in the 1v1, it can be a little bit easier to move Azir out of lane. I also think that fleet a lot of the time can be a bait. Like, it's easy to just go fleet and be like, okay, yeah, I'll get through the lane. But you can give up a lot of scaling for that, or a lot of skirmishing potential, right? Like, if you don't have Hob for the skirmishes or Conk for the scaling, that can hurt. So I would say Azir is probably somewhere in here. Like, he is still a pretty strong blind, but I think he's definitely a bit weaker now and probably on the lower end of blinds. As a champion, though, at least just like purely design, he is broken as a blind pick, right? So he probably should be on there. Our next one, so these don't really look like mid laners here. I will maybe talk about some off meta, like really off meta things like Bran at the end, but honestly, I don't really want to talk about them that much because I just don't think most people play them. So Cassio is also probably a C or potentially D tier blind. Like, the thing with Cassio is that Cassio is so good against certain champs, right? Like, Cassio as a counter absolutely obliterates things like Sylas or Yone. You know, Yasuo is another very good one. In the lane phase, in the team fights, just counters them at all stages of the game. So for you to blind pick Cassio, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? Like, you can blind Cassio, and in difficult matchups, you can go for something like Aurora. You could even go something like Comet or Ahri and try, like, you know, 3 points Q. And that can allow you to stabilize these matchups. But ultimately, if you're capable of playing something else, you probably would. So I think Cassio is probably a C tier blind overall. You can win some of those more difficult matchups, but you really would just have a much better time blinding something else. Corki. So I think Corki is kind of underrated as a blind, honestly. And the reason for that is, one, he is also a champ that's pretty overtuned at the moment. But also he has a lot of range, and similar to what's this champ? Similar to Anivia, at level 6, he gains the ability to pretty much neutralize most lanes, right? He can kind of just clear from range. He scales extremely well. There are obviously difficult matchups for Corki, and that's really the biggest risk of blinding Corki. It's not so much that you're going to get punished so hard, but that you might give your opponent the ability to win lane and outscale. So if you play Corki into something like, well, Sol, or if you played Corki into Kassadin or something like that, right? Those can be very difficult because you're not going to be able to punish those in the early game, and they're going to scale, you know, just as well alongside you while also probably winning the early game. So be careful blinding Corki. That being said, compositionally, Corki is actually quite good. He also, remember, he has a very defensive build path that he can go for. He can go for the Maul build if he needs to. But I think Corki probably slots in on the B tier. It's a blind, potentially even above Akshan, just because Akshan, again, gains more value as a counter. But you have to be... Yeah, it really depends, like, what you're valuing, you know, because, like, if you really value having pressure in the early game, then obviously Akshan is a better blind for Corki for that reason, right? And you might find that if you're playing, let's say you're playing, I don't know, in a game where you think they're going to go for a roaming mid, you'd probably rather go Akshan over Corki, right? But Corki, I think, overall, is still a pretty decent blind. Our next one is Diana. So this is one that gains value as a flex pick. And I would say for that reason, Diana is probably a high B, potentially a bit higher. So in the past, Diana has been a fairly mediocre mid, but she is reasonably strong at the moment with the phase rush build, and she's a counter to certain meta mids such as Talia, which gets her value. Diana can be played jungle, but I don't think she's like OP in jungle at the moment, so there's a little bit of flex pick potential, but I think a lot of the time people will just see Diana and assume it's mid. So for that reason, it's probably somewhere in here. I think one thing that's kind of nice about Diana is that because she's been out of meta for a while, people don't really know what to pick into her a lot of the time. So you can get away with some blind pick Diana sometimes, but I think she also gains higher value as a counter, and you could maybe put her in C just because of that. But I do think she is like reasonably blindable. Ekko. So I think Ekko is also not great blind. I think he's very similar to Diana in the sense that like this champ, if you get away with the laning phase, scales very, very well and can really take over the game. But I don't think he's that great a neutralizer anymore. When he used to have more wave clear, it was a lot easier. But I think nowadays it's still not the best. That being said, he does have a lot of mobility, which is pretty nice. And that can make him more blindable into comps that maybe these champs wouldn't be, right? Like even if you can win those difficult matchups, Cassio, if you end up against something like, Syndra plus Jarvan, as I always say, that would suck. But I think Ekko can play against those reasonably well. So Ekko, I think, yeah, very similar to Diana, but overall still not the best blind. Fizz. Okay, so Fizz, I would probably say is either a high B or a low A. So Fizz is a very interesting champ because Fizz definitely has some difficult matchups. Stuff like LeBlanc, I think, can be quite difficult for Fizz. But the thing is that most champs that are good against Fizz in the 1v1 tend to be very vulnerable to ganks, and Fizz has great gank setup. So, if you imagine a champ like Ori that can bully out Fizz in the 1v1 at 6 or even at 3, you can potentially gank this champ, which gets you a lot of value. I think that Fizz and solo queue also, sort of similar to like Katarina and stuff, can just get fed randomly. I'd put Fizz somewhere like here. I still think that Fizz, as an assassin that needs to snowball, is always going to be more valuable as a counter pick. But I think of the, blindable kind of roaming assassins, he might be the best. And can snowball, mainly because he has ganks up, which a lot of AP assassins cannot stay the same for that, right? And I guess a lot of assassins in general don't have that 1v1 gank setup. They bring a lot of damage, but Fizz just having a slow and I guess a knock-up is super, super valuable. Now, Galio is another interesting one. I think Galio is probably somewhere in the B tier. So Galio does have a lot of impact on the game early, but you're potentially giving over free scaling. And also, he cannot play that well into certain comps, things with great disengage or a lot of mobility. Imagine you're playing something like a Xayah into something like a Xayah, excuse me. It can be very, very hard to play a Galio. Galio, though, becomes really good if your team has already picked certain champs. So something you might want to consider is like, let's say you haven't seen the enemy mid matchup, but you have seen that your team already has Camille and Rakan or something. That could be a good game to blind pick Galio. But overall, just in terms of general blind pick ability, probably not the best. You really risk giving over a bunch of free scaling. Imagine you versus some kind of first strike user or something like Anivia or Cassio that just really, really punishes short range. You can have a lot of trouble with that. Next one. So Gragas mid is something that I think is kind of underrated, and I actually think is a pretty strong blind. In fact, I'd probably put him somewhere in here. The thing with Gragas blind is that most of the time, people will not assume it's Gragas mid. They'll be assuming it's probably Gragas top or jungle or even support before they think it's Gragas mid. And that gains a lot of value for you. I also think that Gragas is extremely hard to push out of lane. And on top of that, he actually counters a lot of champs too, right? It's a blind pick that also really, really shuts down melee champs. So against like half the mid lane roster is already going to be quite a strong pick, right? Like you might actually find yourself in a favorable matchup despite blind picking. So I think Gragas, very underrated. And I guess the most difficult champs are ones with sustain or ones with the ability, short cooldown dashes that can avoid your Q poke or, can outrange you or something like that. But overall, I think Gragas blind, honestly, gets a lot of value. Now, our next one is Hwei. So Hwei is probably in the A tier as well. I think probably, a little dependent on the game itself and dependent on what you're seeing. So the thing with Hwei, very strong in lane, beats just about everything in lane. But he is sort of bad against some of the harder, gank setup champs. Again, if you're something like a Fizz and they've got a ganking jungler, that can be hard. That being said, you do have tools to deal with it, right? Like you have a self-peel with your fear. You can speed yourself up. You can shield yourself to avoid a dive. There are ways you can play around this, but I think for the lack of mobility, it's a little lower for me. Yeah, I don't know. The thing is, it really depends what you've seen, right? If we're first pick blinding Hwei and we haven't seen anything in the game at all, then he's probably not the greatest, just because he doesn't have that mobility. But if you've already seen that they don't have a lot of threat in their jungle or support, even if you haven't seen the mid matchup, you can pretty much just lock it in. So, Hwei, it's probably somewhere in the high A tier. Maybe, yeah, somewhere in here. I think it is solid overall and definitely a champ that you guys should be thinking about as your blind pick. Just be very careful, again, of those strong gank setup mid jungles. Irelia. So Irelia is a interesting one, very interesting one. So Irelia, first off, is a flex. And I think most people assume it will be Irelia top, but Irelia mid is still fairly common, right? So it's not unheard of. It's not something like Gragas where they'll be very surprised to see this mid. It's still something they'll think about. So the nice thing about Aurelia mid is that she has very few bad lane matchups, right? She does beat just about everything in lane. The problem is Aurelia does sort of need to play from ahead, and also compositionally, Aurelia can be fairly countered. I would say Aurelia is one of the best mid lane counter picks in the game, and so that makes me kind of want to put her lower. But at the same time, I actually think that because she's a flex and because she wins pretty much every matchup, that she probably is a fairly solid blind overall. I'd probably put her somewhere in here. Yeah, definitely blindable, but gains a lot more value as a counter pick. Next one is Jayce. So I think Jayce is a pretty good blind, and the reason for that is he's a flex, and most of the mid champs that counterpick Jayce aren't necessarily that good against, or aren't just good blinds. So if, like, for example, something like a Syndra, right, that is quite good against Jayce, if they pick it and it turns out to be Jayce top, and then you verse something like Irelia or Fizz mid, that could really suck for the Syndra. So the Syndra has to be quite careful. As I said at the very start of this video, when I play Jayce, I like to ban Irelia, and that makes them think that I'm playing Jayce top a lot of the time, and then you can get a, relatively free Jayce mid matchup. I'd probably put Jayce somewhere in here at the moment. You also have pseudo mobility because you have phase rush if you really need it, and that can help unless it's, super hard lockdown, or, again, some really crazy combo that just has too much damage to deal with. But, you can easily rush tier 2 boots on this champ, something like Mercs. You can go the phase rush. It's easy to take even Doran's Shield Resolve in some of the more difficult matchups if you really need it. So yeah, overall, I think Jayce probably the best AD mid blind, or very close to it, and should definitely be one you think about if you can play it, obviously. I did do a Jayce guide, so go check that out. Next one, Karma. So I think Karma as a blind is really, really good, potentially like A or maybe even S. I'm actually, do I give it S? I think no. So the thing that keeps Karma out of S for me is I do think it can give some champs free scaling. Now, Karma still has a lot of pressure over the lane, but there are some champs that have enough push that Karma can't really punish. So in Korean solo queue, a lot of the time when Karma was picked, people were just instantly picking Corki into it, and that can be really difficult for Karma to actually get a huge advantage. And obviously, you get mega outscaled. But, it's a triple flex, works with most comps, works against most comps, only has a couple really difficult matchups, and most of those matchups tend to not actually be that good later in the game versus you. So something like Irelia, it's very rough 1v1, but I'd say in team fights, Karma does very well against Irelia. So definitely worth having a look at. I will say that the Karma nerfs hit Karma pretty hard. So as a champ at the moment, like, remember that this is not, while I am factoring in the champion's power a little bit, this isn't just a mid lane tier list. And you want to go check my patch tier list out if that's what you want. So she's like fairly solid blind, but I don't think she's OP. In fact, she's probably somewhere in here, gaining value as a blind mainly because of her flex pick potential, but probably isn't quite as strong as some of the other champs on this list. What else do we have? So Kassadin. Kassadin is probably our first D tier blind. And again, it's not because Kassadin can't, neutralize some of these matchups, right? I remember coaching someone recently who played some AD matchups as Qiyana, or as Kassadin, playing into stuff like Qiyana. And honestly, you can win these matchups, right? If you play really well. But it's so much better to just counterpick with Kassadin, right? I honestly think if you're a Kassadin one trick, you would find the game to be so much easier if you learned just one other blind pick champ, and then you purely counterpick Kassadin, right? Because if you're so good that you can neutralize these bad matchups as Kassadin, imagine how much impact you're going to have if you're the one countering and if you're not falling too far behind in the early game. And remember that it's not just you that falls behind. Even if you're even in CS, it might be that your bot lane or your jungle paid for you to have that even CS, right? Because they were getting invaded or they were getting roamed on or whatever. So be careful of that. Yeah, I really do think it's so much better as a counter, and there really is no point blinding it. Our next one is Katarina. So Katarina as a blind is overall, I would say, not very good. I think that Katarina is, I guess, like OP in solo queue in the sense that, like, she can find a lot of random kills here and there and can end up snowballing, but it's so much easier to do that as a counter pick. And I think just about every mid in the game is going to have, a lot of power against Katarina in lane. And also, a lot of meta picks are quite good against Katarina. So something like a Hwei or a Jayce is really difficult for Kat. So I think Kat overall, really not that great a blind. Again, maybe just because it's solo queue, you can get away with it more often than you should. But you're going to lose lane to pretty much anything, and it can be tough unless you're really good at Katarina and can find those kills that you need to get snowballing. LeBlanc is our next one, and it's probably around B tier as a blind pick, so she's a bit more conditional. She's kind of like Galio, where, like, if you have the right champs around you, if you have like a ganking jungle, ganking support, it can be a pretty good blind, or it can be a pretty good compositional blind if you see your lane, right? Like, if you see a melee matchup you can then normally play into most comps and you know, with most comps. But I think overall, you kind of do need to see either the enemy team comp or like your team comp or the lane, or you need to see something as LeBlanc. I don't think it's a great just first pick, you know, blue side blind pick. But it's pretty decent. You know, it has a dash and it does bring reasonable utility as well as a lot of damage. So it shouldn't be slept on as a blind, but it's probably better used as a counter pick for the most part. We have Lissandra. So Lissandra in the past was a really, really good blind because she used to have a lot more wave clear than she did now. But the problem with blinding Lissandra these days is that there are a lot of mages that punish her in lane, and there's a lot of champs that do so while also outscaling her. That being said, Lissandra, similar to LeBlanc, does really, really well if you have ganks up around you. In fact, that's extremely similar to Galio. If you've got engage tools on your team, if you've got things that can threaten mid, then normally you can play into just about anything. One downside, I guess, as Lissandra is sometimes you can end up in comps where you only really have one target. So, like, for example, I don't know, maybe the enemy picked like a utility mid and you have to kill the enemy ADC. If the enemy ADC has cleanse and their support has Mikhail's, your job can be really, really hard. So I would probably say Lissandra is around B tier as a blind, and overall I think she's better used as either a counter pick to assassins, or perhaps better used if you just have, you know, a lot of gank or just in general engaged threat on your team. By now, you should all know my thoughts on Lux. I think Lux is very OP as a champ in general, and I also think she's a really, really good blind pick. So she has great ability to neutralize. Once she hits level 6, her ult is low enough cooldown that you can do basically every other wave, which is amazing for neutralizing. I also think that Lux is a pretty big lane bully, right? Like, Lux wins a lot of lanes anyway, especially range versus range lanes. And against the melee champs, a lot of the time, if you hold Q defensively, or if you take a defensive sum, you should be able to play against most of these. So I think Lux gains a lot of value just for that. On top of that, Lux is a very powerful flex pick. So Lux, I think, is a pretty good AP carry, can be played in the bot lane. In fact, I won a game as Lux on 300 ping in bot lane recently. Lux support, obviously, is pretty strong as well. So I think if you are picking Lux, most of the time they will think it's mid. So it can be hard to kind of, you know, ban something for another lane and then have them expect it to be in that lane, because Lux is most commonly mid anyway. But I honestly think it doesn't matter. I think it's super strong overall. And if you're a Lux abuser, like some people I know, yeah, keep doing it. Honestly, it's a very strong blind pick and certainly good to have in the pool. Malz is a sort of interesting one. So I want to say Malz is like either D tier or potentially C. So the thing with Malz is there are a lot of champs that you can pick into him that win him in lane and outscale. You know, if you play Malz, you're potentially giving over a free Smolder mid, Sol, Corki. You know, what else is there? I'm sure there's some other super scalers that you can play, or even, you know, like a Kassadin, a Veigar. There's lots of champs that you can pick into this that just absolutely destroy him, right? There are also things that will bully him, you know, not just in scaling, but in terms of pure laning. So something like a Syndra would absolutely annihilate a Malzahar, or Aurelia, or a Hwei, or something like that. Something that can just kill the Voidlings the moment they come out, stop them ever from pushing, you know, and have the ability just to build up a substantial lane lead. So I really don't think that Malz should be used as a blind anymore. I think he is exclusively a counter pick, and I would look for that instead. So Naafiri is probably a C tier blind overall. I don't think she's a great blind. I think she is a little better than some of the others, though. She probably makes it into a very low B. The thing with Naafiri is that she can farm from range, which is pretty nice, and she doesn't necessarily need Snowball. She scales pretty well. But there are a lot of champs that can really make Naafiri's life difficult. Ones that can either CC her immediately upon going in, or have some way to cancel her W. So you can think of things like, you know, if you go in and you get immediately like LeBlanc chained, or Lux queued, or, you know, Hwei feared, or Ahri charm, you know, stuff like that. That can all be really difficult for Naafiri. But if you're getting against something that doesn't have this, Naafiri can actually be an okay blind. And again, the ability to farm from range is quite unique for assassins. Only, I think, Zed is the only other one off the top of my head that can do this. So that does provide a lot of value, but overall, I still think Naafiri is much, much better suited for counterpicking. Neeko, I think Neeko is pretty damn good as a blind. I would say Neeko is probably somewhere around here. So the thing with Neeko is that she has a very, very strong laning phase, and she also has the ability to play into most comps and against most comps. Really, the biggest weaknesses Neeko is that you kind of do need to snowball, right? Like, this is a champ that needs to build kind of like flat pen items, needs to be able to have a lot of impact in early skirmishes. While you can just win a random fight late game by getting a big ult, like that's always possible. I think in terms of consistency, you do need to snowball. And there are some champions that can maybe not beat Neeko in lane, but can at least neutralize Neeko in lane. So, but they are kind of few and far between. So overall, I think pretty strong blind. Kind of has pseudo mobility and self peel as well, you know, just with the W as well as having the stuns and stuff. So it is pretty solid overall. Yeah, maybe somewhere around here. It's a bit of a shame that Neeko's support isn't stronger, because then it would be much better as a flex. But for now, it's still quite strong. Moving on, looks like our next one here is Ahri. So Ahri's another kind of interesting one, where if you've seen some stuff, she can be a much better blind. So I think Ahri is somewhere in the mid B as a blind, just to feel like literally first pick blinding her, like maybe somewhere like here. The thing with Ahri is that if you're against like a lot of threat, you can look to go phase rush or something, right? You can go like phase rush Seraphs and you should be okay. That being said, Ahri, just as a blind for matchups, is very, very good. Like Ahri wins pretty much every matchup in the game if you can take Comet. But the problem is, you know, let's say you blind Ahri and you end up against something like Syndra, but then you're forced to take phase rush because they have too much threat, then it's not necessarily going to be that good. So if you kind of see the enemy team already and you see that they have relatively low threat in their mid jungle or whatever, or maybe their, I don't know, their support jungle, I guess. You haven't seen the mid matchup, but you've seen the support jungle, then it can be a good blind. But if you're blinding Ahri without having seen, you know, enough of the enemy comp, they might still pick some hard engage or something, or they might pick a lane that you're forced to take Comet into, and then not have phase rush. That can make life very difficult. So overall, I think Ahri nowadays is much better as a mage counter pick. But you can maybe blind pick her, especially if you've seen, you know, the right champs in the enemy team. Pantheon doesn't really get played mid anymore, which can kind of be a bonus, right? So Pantheon definitely used to be a mid laner that was played fairly often. And he was one of the better AD mids at some point. I still think Pantheon is okay, but he's not amazing. He's probably somewhere in here. I think Pantheon mid, again, mainly because people don't know what to pick into him and because he's not common right now, can potentially get value as a blind pick. But the problem with Pantheon blind is that there are a lot of meta champs that do quite well into him. So champs that have the ability to cancel his W or to CC him immediately can really struggle, or can really destroy him. So something like Ahri Charm, again, Hwei E, Lux Q, Gragas E, Neeko E, all these can make trading as Pantheon very tough. And I think overall there actually just aren't that many matchups that you'd want to be into, right? Like even if you blind Pantheon and you end up against the safe blind as Ahri, you wouldn't really be that happy with that, right? I think at the moment, Pantheon is probably more of a counter pick, I think, as, you know, into melee mids. But he has some gank set up and like he can roam, you know, he's fairly hard to push out of lane. So he probably has some value overall, but I think just better used as a counter pick for the most part. Qiyana is a interesting one. I think Qiyana is probably in C. The thing is, Qiyana, I see her in a lot of ways as being similar to Cassio, as this champ is probably pretty underrated if you get good matchups for her, but I feel like the good matchups are kind of few and far between. And in my games, at least, when people blind pick Qiyana, it's like the freest LeBlanc game of all time. You know, it's hard to snowball against, and you generally win the lane. So that can be hard for Qiyana, is that if you do play against something like, you know, an Ahri or LeBlanc, like it's very hard to snowball against them, and they do quite well against you for most of the game. So it's a really good champ to have in your champion pool. If you can play Qiyana to a high level, you can definitely 1v9 games with her. But I think she's much better suited to the counterpick role. Rumble, also not much of a mid laner these days, but again, that kind of gives him some value. So I think Rumble as a blind is actually pretty good. I would say Rumble is probably an A as a mid lane blind pick. He has the ability to play into both ranged and melee. Pretty much destroys melee, just to begin with. And it's pretty good against range as well, because you can farm with harpoons. Also, a lot of range champs are quite vulnerable to Rumble in fights, because they tend to be more immobile. And he's pretty good against some of the blinds these days as well. So it's definitely a champ that, if you happen to play Rumble, can be good. And also, if you play it top as well, can be good. But it's definitely not OP, right? So a lot of the blind pick, you know, ability of Rumble is coming from the fact that they don't think it's Rumble mid. If your teammate has already picked a top laner or something, then Rumble probably isn't that valuable. But like, again, if you're picking very early in the draft, you haven't seen a whole lot, I think Rumble can be a pretty good pick. Ryze, Ryze, kind of similar to LeBlanc in some ways. I think Ryze gains a lot of value if you have like a pushing bot lane and you have a lot of CC. You know, if you have a jungler like a Xin Zhao, Rek'Sai, or Lee Sin, you can make a lot of plays on mid. Even in the more difficult matchups, you'll generally be able to win out. If you also have like strong setup in side lanes or winning lanes, like if you have Renekton top, or you have like Caitlyn Lux, or plus the Nautilus, you know, Kai'Sa Rel, anything like this, that will, you know, raise the Ryze stocks for you. But as a pure first pick, blind pick, I think Ryze is pretty poor. He'd probably be somewhere down here. He is a really good counter to certain champs. Like I think he's really good against Qiyana, or against Akali at the moment. He is pretty good against most assassins in general. But I think when I'm picking Ryze, I'm thinking less about the mid matchup and more about the team that I have around me. Ryze is also pretty damn weak against any sort of longer range comp, or just a comp that punishes short range with heavy CC. So be a bit careful blind picking Ryze at the moment. But if you see the right champs on your team, then potentially, even if you haven't seen the mid the Ryze blind pick value can go up. Seraphine, I think, is probably in the B tier overall as a blind, so she is a pretty good neutralizer. She's basically always going to be able to farm from range. She's pretty hard to kill in lane, and she is a triple flex, right? I think Seraphine can be played mid, AD, or support, with support probably being the best role at the moment. The biggest weakness of Seraphine mid is that you're potentially giving free scaling over to some champ that you just can't punish. So imagine you blind Seraphine and you end up against a Corki or an Sol or a Kassadin or something like that. Maybe First Strike, Gathering Storm, Syndra. All these sorts of champs can just kind of like, yeah, just really heavily outscale you, and you don't really have a way to punish. So if you want to succeed, I guess, with the blind pick Seraphine, you're really relying on either having the champs around you that really benefit from your buffs, right? Like a lot of bruises or a lot of engage, or you've just got to be a really good Seraphine player, right? Like if you're someone like Cupid or someone like Snatched Wig, you can probably find a lot of value in the team fights, but you really... I think if you're blinding Seraphine, you definitely need to be above average with her. I don't think it's enough to just be an average Seraphine. Swain overall, I think, is probably a C tier blind. I really don't think it's that valuable. It loses lane to a lot of champs and gets outscaled very hard as well. There's plenty of champs that can neutralize him by, just like punishing his lack of wave clear or CCing him in team fights, making it hard to continue his ulti. I think you're better off just picking Swain as a counter pick into melees, even though you can win some of the more difficult lanes by taking Ahri Scourge. I really think at that point, you'd just rather be a different champ. So for me, pretty low down on the list, but there is a little bit of value just from the fact that a lot of people won't know what to play against Swain. Like I think if you do want to know what to play against Swain, stuff like Cassio, Anivia, Lux, Hwei, Ahri, all these champs that can kind of poke from range, keep them from far away, have CC as well, go a really long way. But if you play a melee into Swain, imagine something like a Qiyana, I think Swain definitely comes out on top. Sylas, so Sylas I was a bit disappointed by. I thought Sylas jungle might take off a bit more than it did, but it turns out Sylas jungle is still not the best, which means as a blind pick, Sylas also is fairly low value. I'd say he is in the C tier. I think that you can blind pick Sylas in the same sort of way that you can blind pick LeBlanc, where if you see, well, for LeBlanc, you need to see gank setup or, a very vulnerable lane. As Sylas, if you see really good ults, then potentially you can still blind pick Sylas as long as you have a ganking jungler. That being said, Sylas is not really built for blind picking, and you really need to see something, whether that's ults or a free matchup, or, you've got a lot of threat on your team, like you've got a Jarvan and a Rel that can come mid all the time. Overall, though, I think Sylas is so strong as a counter pick that there really just isn't that much point in blinding him. Syndra has probably changed the most of any champ between seasons. So Syndra last season was similar to Ahri, I guess, like a very easy champion to blind pick. I think at the moment, though, Syndra's blind pick ability is pretty poor. So she suffers against some of the other meta matchups. So something like an Akali or an Aurelia. She's also quite bad against assassins like Fizz or Katarina. Even, Sylas with gank setup. So overall, I think Syndra is probably a better counter pick. That being said, I think she is more blindable than some of the others. She's very similar to Ahri, so I'll probably put her next to her. Somewhere around here where even though you lack mobility, you still scale very well. You don't necessarily need to snowball, and you do have some self-peel. But overall, I would much prefer that you guys use Syndra as a counter pick. Taliyah is definitely a benefactor of the meta. So Taliyah at the moment is a relatively good blind, but I will say that Taliyah is not normally a good blind. So Taliyah would probably fit somewhere around here. The thing with Taliyah is that because she is so strong, because she scales so well, even if you fall behind in the early game, it's normally going to be fine. Also, she has a lot of wave clear, so you can just absolutely like nuke waves just over and over, whether that's clearing them under your tower or just pushing them into your opponent over and over. That being said, normally Taliyah is not that great a blind because you really suffer against other mage matchups, stuff like Ahri Syndra. You suffer against gank setup melee, stuff like Fizz. You get free matchups over into stuff like Kassadin. But again, I think at the moment, just because of how overtuned she is, she probably is worth playing as a blind, but I don't expect this to last. Like, Taliyah is getting some nerfs next patch. They're not the biggest, but I expect Taliyah is one of those champs that will get toned down a bit more. But at least for now, I think definitely has value as a blind and is probably somewhere around here. Talon at the moment is, I would say, not a very good blind. I'd probably put him somewhere down here. The thing is, Talon has the ability to carry a game so easily if he's able to counterpick and get ahead, but there's so many champs that do so well into Talon. If you're blinding Talon, you can get crushed in lane by something like an Ahri. You can get very heavily neutralized by something like Ahri or Lissandra. Champs like LeBlanc can, set up ganks on you over and over. Neekos can push you out of lane. Stuff like that. So I think overall, the current mid-meta isn't too favorable for Talon, which makes him fairly unblindable. That being said, he is a pretty good counter. If you do manage to, similar to Qiyana, get some of those really good matchups, you can snowball and take over the game really easily, but it's just at the moment, that's not often feasible. Tristana, I would probably say is an A tier blind. I want to say somewhere around, maybe somewhere around here. I think she is pretty good. So she has mobility, she has a strong laning phase, she does scale reasonably well. I do think, though, that Tristana is probably better used as a counter generally because she gains value a lot from snowballing, right? She can really speed up the game. Trist, when ahead, is very, very destructive. And there are champs that can be very hard to snowball against, right? Something like a Hwei, I think at best you can go even as Tristana, if not fall behind. But you really want to get ahead, right? Champs like Syndra just outright beat you. Cassio can be pretty hard. Lux can be pretty difficult. So there's enough bad matchups that I think blinding Trist isn't amazing, but it's also not bad. And because AD mids are fairly hard to blind anyway, she gains some value just because there's not many of them that are blindable. And sometimes you do need to blind an AD mid, right? Like if your team has picked a lot of AP already. Twisted Fate is one that I think can actually depend a lot on what elo you're in. And the reason I say that is because in high elo, Twisted Fate gets played top a fair amount. And I think Twisted Fate top is still very strong. And so if you pick TF mid, a lot of the time they can be expecting its top, especially if you ban something like Jax. So Jax is a very hard counter to TF top. So if you ban Jax, people will just expect that you're playing TF top. And that can help you get a better mid matchup. I also think that if you're playing in higher elo, it's more likely that you get more assistance from your jungler and more assistance from your support. And as a gank setup mid laner, that's going to be very valuable for you. I think if you're just picking TF, you know, just picking it mid, not banning anything for it, not trying to trick them into thinking it's top, then it's probably not a good blind. It probably does sit somewhere around here where it is a reasonable neutralizer, but it feels a lot better if you have the tools around you either to help you snowball or to help them snowball, right? You know, ganking junglers or gank setup on side lanes can be very, very nice. I do think because of its value as a flex pick, TF blind is actually maybe, you know, maybe pretty high in the B tier, maybe somewhere like this. But again, really reliant, I think, on having teammates that can play around you and the the implied threat of TF top. I think that's super, super important. If they know it's TF mid and you come up against something like a Fizz or a Yasuo or even something that can just, you know, pin you to the tower like an Ahri, I think that's all generally going to be pretty unfavorable. Yeah, unless you have some gank set up with you or something. So getting near the end now, Veigar, I would say probably is either in C tier or potentially even D. So I think the thing with Veigar is that Veigar is extremely good against shorter range comps and extremely good in matchups where he gets to farm for free. Like if you played something like Veigar versus Malzahar, you would be extremely happy, especially if there was a short range comp around them. I do think Veigar in general though is not a great blind. There's a lot of champs that can be picked into Veigar and then outrange him and outscale, so something like a Corki. And there's also lots of champs that just outright beat Veigar in lane. That being said, the one nice thing, or I guess a couple of nice things about Veigar, is that you can build Roa first if you really need to, right? Like if you really need the tankiness, the ability to neutralize a bad lane, you can. And also if you need the... And also you do have gank setup, which means that you can always get bailed out in that way. You know, some champs, they don't really have anything to offer, pre-6 especially, you know, something like Malz. You just kind of have to take the dick for the first 6 minutes. But Veigar at least has some threat, the ability to farm from reasonably far away, and can build reasonably tanky if he needs to in order to help neutralize some of those more difficult lanes. Vel'Koz doesn't really get played mid at all anymore. That being said, I actually think he's not the worst blind. I'd actually say he's somewhere up here. So I think the main reason Vel'Koz isn't played mid at the moment is because there's a lot of other champs that just do his job better. That being said, most of the time, people aren't going to think it's mid, and he has a lot of wave clears, so he can neutralize fairly easily, kind of similar to Lux. That being said, he is just more punishable than Lux, right? So I think it's like if you want a safe neutralizer, why would you go Lux over Vel'Koz? If you want kind of like anti-mage bully, why would you go Vel'Koz over something like Syndra or Victor? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. So he's probably better used as a counter into short-range mages. Like I think something like Vel'Koz into Ryze is actually not bad. And honestly, it's probably an okay neutralizer, but for me, it just loses value as a blind pick because I actually don't think it provides anything as a champ that another champ doesn't do already. I really do think if you're blinding Vel'Koz, champs like Lux are just easier. Champs like Syndra are just stronger. And overall, like, he doesn't really have much of an identity. Vex is sort of interesting. I think for me, Vex would probably be somewhere as a high C or potentially a low B. Yeah, I want to say she's in the low B, somewhere in here. So I think the thing with Vex is that she has a lot of wave clear, which means that even in more difficult matchups, she can be okay. But she gets so much value against shorter range comps and against anti-dashes that she's just so much better used as a counter. And the thing is that even though she is kind of meant to be a counter to champs like LeBlanc, a lot of the time you can lose just because of the ganks, right? Like, even though you beat champs like Yone, Yasuo, LeBlanc 1v1, the gank threat that comes with them can make life really difficult. So I think you're better off using Vex as a counter. Overall, not the best blind. Can be used to neutralize lanes, but for me, it's just a counter pick champion. Victor, where would we put Victor? So Victor's kind of similar to Ori, where most of Victor's matchups are winning. Victor pretty much destroys any matchup. That being said, very vulnerable to jungle and support ganks and can really struggle against some of their harder engaged compositions. So if you see the enemy mid or you see the enemy comp, you can probably feel comfortable locking in Victor, but I think without having seen anything, you probably don't want to. You can obviously reach a point where you can just kind of scale and wave clear, which means he's probably somewhere, I want to say he's like similar to Corki, with like different strengths and weaknesses, right? Like Corki kind of struggles in lane a lot harder, but is generally fine against the supports and jungles, whereas Victor doesn't struggle in lane at all, but, you know, struggles a lot with those supports and jungles. So has to be a bit careful with that, and for me, probably means he's just somewhere in the low B tier there. Vlad, I would say, is probably in the C tier of blinds as well, mainly because, again, he's such a good counter, and the thing with Vlad is that he has very hard winning and very hard losing matchups. Like, I think if you play Vlad and you play against something like a Cassio or a Ryze, or some kind of like Ignite all-in, it can be pretty hard. But if you play Vlad, there are some champs that just cannot deal with Vlad at all, right? So he's an amazing counter pick champion. He's probably up there with Kassadin in terms of being an S+ counter pick, but I really do think in blind ability, he's pretty poor. I guess the things that are going for Vlad is that he is very hard to gank still, and he does scale pretty well. Doesn't necessarily need to snowball. So it probably is a pretty high C tier, somewhere around here. But overall, I would just not really recommend blinding Vlad. I think I would go for something else. Yasuo, in my opinion, definitely not blindable. I think he goes down in the D tier. I think there are a lot of champions that can either beat Yasuo in lane or heavily neutralize. And Yasuo is a champion that needs to snowball. That being said, Yasuo rises in priority a lot if he has certain champs on his team. So if you have like Diana or Gragas or Nautilus or Malphite, you know, all these can kind of make the Yasuo blind pick ability go up if you've seen the right things around you. But if you blind Yasuo and you end up versus like LeBlanc or Akali or Gragas, something that can neutralize or make, you know, team fighting, something like a Talia or Lissandra can make team fighting very difficult. Overall, I think he's so much better as a counter pick, unless you've got those very specific champs around you. Xerath, I just realized I missed Xerath. Xerath should probably be somewhere in C tier as well, or maybe a low B. So the thing is that Xerath he's a good anti-mage counter, and he is, you know, generally pretty strong against mages. There are better anti-mages though, again, like Victor or Syndra if you don't need mobility, Kassadin if you do. You do have a little bit of self-peel, and you do have good wave clear, but honestly, I kind of feel like Xerath is a champ that needs to snowball. I feel like if you go even on Xerath, poke champs just from an even footing generally don't feel that valuable, especially ones that don't have the ability to kind of create chaos in the game. So something like Lux can hit a random Q and suddenly things happen. Zoe can hit a bubble and suddenly someone dies, right? Xerath, you don't really have the ability to hit a random E and then follow up because it's just not got the same range as the other two do. And also, you know, it can't hit multiple people like Lux Q. So I think Xerath overall is, you know, partially just a bit weaker than other options, but I also think you're just better off using him as an anti-mage counter. He does kind of struggle against some of the gank setup melees, something like a Fizz or a Yone maybe, but, you know, you can kind of clear and just play to scale. But personally, it doesn't really feel like then you're getting the most value out of Xerath. Almost at the end now, so Yone, I would say, is probably somewhere in here. Yone is a slightly better blind than Yasuo, but still not great. I do think Yone is reasonably strong in the patch with the IE buffs. But overall, I think he does have some pretty hard counters in mid, and there are a lot of matchups where you wouldn't be too happy with. Generally, even if you don't get ahead in lane, you'll be okay, but some of the, you know, some champs that you do actually bully in lane can be really annoying for you later on. Like, you can definitely beat Talia in lane, but then Talia in teamfights can be a real pain for you. And there are just some champs that absolutely obliterate you in the laning phase as well. So you do have to be quite careful with the Yone blind. The one bonus that Yone has going for him is that it is a flex and people do play Yone top fairly often. So potentially you could ban a top laner and maybe trick people with that. And I also think Yone probably does have more value as a blind in lower elos because a lot of the champs that hard counter Yone are pretty hard to play. So you can maybe get away with it as a blind, you know, below diamond a bit easier. But I would probably say as you get a bit higher, yeah, you should be careful blinding Yone, I'd say. Zed. So I think Zed, at least design-wise, is one of the best AD mid blinds. But I feel like Zed at the moment isn't amazing. He is okay with like the TP First Strike Eclipse build, but it still kind of feels like you'd rather play something else. I am sort of tempted to put him as either a very low A or a high B. Now, again, this isn't representative of how strong Zed is as a champ. It's factoring that in. But I do think he is a good blind, right? Like, he is able to poke from far away. He can farm from afar. He doesn't have any mana costs. You know, it's fine for him to go TP. Isn't reliant really on snowballing. So you should be fine, I think, with blinding Zed most of the time. But it's a champ that, if you take the wrong setup, can definitely be bad. So there are times where you need to take TPD shield, for example, and if people take the wrong thing, they could really suffer. So I want to say it's a high B. I don't know. I'll give it a high B. I don't think it quite makes it into the A tier with the rest of these, because these do just look like a little bit of stronger champs for me. But I think Zed is one of the best AD mids to blind, and if you play a lot of AD mids, it's something you should consider having in your pool. Zoe, I think we can put somewhere as a low B. I think she has a lot of potential for snowballing solo queue in general. But she is fairly vulnerable to certain types of champs. Like, she's quite difficult to play against assassins. Pretty hard to play against hard engage, especially ones from support that can go on her when she portals forward. That being said, a lot of the time Zoe can just randomly get fed, kind of like Katarina, and just end up snowballing the game, you know, through Electrocute Ignite or something like that. But overall, it's not a very consistent blind pick, I'd say. If you're really good at Zoe, you can make it work, and it's a champ that I used to blind all the time. But I think in the current meta, probably not the best blind. Zilean is probably somewhere in the B tier. I want to say somewhere around here, maybe. I think that Zilean as a blind is actually pretty good. Like, people don't know what to pick into it. It does function well with most comps. Not everything. It functions well with bruisers, and it functions well with hyper carries. It is pretty weak to big AoE damage. Like, Zilean's not good against something like Brand. He's much better against kind of direct, you know, burst damage. But the problem is, like, most mids do outscale Zilean, and also most mids do bully Zilean in the lane. So I would say he does get points, mainly because people don't know what to pick into it, and no one plays Zilean mid. They're probably playing it only support, if anything, these days. So in that sense, you can probably get away with it. But I think in terms of giving yourself, you know, the ability to carry the game, it's probably not the best pick overall. And it really is just, you're getting value purely because people don't know what to pick into it, not because it's overall a strong champion. So I think, like, if people do know what to pick into it, honestly, it's a pretty poor blind. Like, it'd probably be down here. But I think just because people aren't really sure what to pick into it, it could maybe go a bit higher. I think I will put it down here. Yeah, I don't know. I just feel, I'm thinking about it more, and I just feel like the problem is, even if people don't know what to pick into it, they're probably just going to pick something like a Tilea anyway and just outscale you, you know, or an ASOL. So, I don't know. Even though people don't know what to pick into it, I really don't think you're going to get away with it anyway. And finally, the last one is Ziggs. So, Ziggs mid blind is okay. It's probably somewhere in here, maybe. I think it has a fair amount of pressure on the lane, and it does have some mobility, scales fairly well. But Ziggs is the champ that really benefits from snowballing. So, if you do manage to get ahead in lane, it's, you know, it's really, really valuable. So I think from that point of view, it gains a lot more value as a blind pick, or sorry, as a counter pick. There really isn't much point to blind a champ like Ziggs, because I think there are other champs that scale similarly and have, you know, a safer time. And yeah, overall, I just don't really like Ziggs a whole lot mid. I do think he is much better as AD carry, because you can play on bot and just neutralize waves while your support roams. But in mid, like, even if you're neutralizing waves, it doesn't necessarily mean that your jungle can then make plays, right? In fact, it would be the opposite. So, yeah, I think we'll leave Ziggs somewhere in the C tier. Maybe, yeah, maybe around there. So overall, I think that's going to be my mid lane blind pick tier list for Season 14. Obviously, I'll get a lot of questions about, you know, where are kind of these fringe off-meta picks, things like Brand or Cho'Gath or something. Chances are, if it's a flex pick, it probably can be played mid, especially because people won't know what to pick into it. But I wanted to mainly keep it to meta champs. One, to try stop this from getting too long, and also because it's just, you know, overall people care about the meta champs a bit more. They're more popular. But if you have questions about off meta mids, put them in the comment section below, and I will try to respond to each of them. And if there are any that I've missed that you think are really good blinds, you know, I know some people will say stuff like Sion or Cassante maybe. Let me know what you guys think of them. Otherwise, again, any questions or thoughts you may have, please put them in the comment section below. If you did like the video, go ahead and like and subscribe. If you want to ask me questions in real time, come to my stream at twitch.tv/shocklol. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one.